In order to be like others, a person gives up a large part of his true self. Schopenhauer understood something deeply uncomfortable about human nature. Most people never become who they truly are, not because they lack potential, not because they lack intelligence, but because slowly and quietly, they are shaped by expectations. Expectations they never consciously chose. Expectations they inherited. And over time, these expectations begin to replace their authentic identity. This process begins much earlier than most people realize. It begins in childhood. Imagine a child who feels naturally drawn towards something.
Not because they were told to pursue it, but because it feels meaningful to them.
It could be drawing, music, building things, exploring ideas. They engage in it freely, without self-doubt, without hesitation, without fear of judgment. Because at that stage, they are not yet divided between who they are and who they believe they are expected to be. But eventually, something changes. A parent makes a comment, a teacher expresses concern, someone says, "That's not practical. That's not realistic. That's not what successful people do." At first, the child may not fully understand the meaning of these words, but they understand the emotional message behind them: disapproval, doubt, uncertainty. And in that moment, something subtle begins to shift. Not externally, but internally. The child begins to observe themselves from the outside. They begin to question their instincts. They begin to adjust their behavior, not because their passion disappeared, but because acceptance suddenly feels uncertain, because approval suddenly feels conditional. And this introduces a new psychological dynamic: the need to be accepted, the need to be approved, the need to avoid rejection. From that point forward, their actions are no longer guided purely by curiosity. They are guided by evaluation. They begin to ask themselves questions they never asked before. Is this acceptable? Will they approve of this? Will this make me respected? And without realizing it, their identity begins to split. There is the self they experience internally, and the self they present externally. Schopenhauer understood this division clearly when he said, "A person can truly be himself only when he is alone. Because when others are present, awareness emerges, self-consciousness appears. The natural flow of behavior becomes interrupted. Instead of simply existing, the individual begins observing themselves, monitoring themselves, adjusting themselves. This pattern continues into adolescence. A teenager begins to notice how social approval shapes their position in the group. They learn which behaviors generate acceptance, which behaviors generate rejection, and they adapt accordingly. They may laugh at things they do not find funny. They may agree with opinions they do not truly hold. They may hide parts of themselves entirely, not because they are weak, but because they are human. Because the human nervous system is designed to avoid social rejection. Over time, this adaptation becomes automatic. It no longer feels like a choice, it feels like survival. This continues into adulthood. In professional environments, the same dynamic exists. Imagine sitting in a meeting where you immediately recognize a flaw in the plan. You see the problem clearly. You understand the consequences. But before speaking, another process begins internally. You hesitate. You begin evaluating. What if I'm wrong? What will they think of me? Will this make me look incompetent? And in that moment, fear overrides clarity. Not fear of physical harm, but fear of social harm, fear of judgment, fear of embarrassment, fear of rejection. So you remain silent, and externally, nothing appears unusual. The meeting continues. The conversation moves forward. But internally, something important has happened. You have prioritized acceptance over authenticity. And when this pattern repeats over years, it fundamentally alters how a person experiences themselves. They begin to lose trust in their own perception. They begin to rely more on external feedback than internal clarity. Their identity becomes externally regulated. Schopenhauer understood the long-term consequence of this. He knew that dependence on approval creates internal instability. Because approval is inherently unpredictable. It changes depending on the audience. It changes depending on the context. It changes depending on expectations that are never fully clear. This makes identity fragile because it is no longer rooted within the individual. It is scattered across the reactions of others. This dynamic becomes especially visible in relationships. At the beginning of a relationship, authenticity flows naturally. There is openness, curiosity, honesty, but over time, awareness emerges. The individual begins noticing patterns, what creates approval, what creates tension, what creates distance, and gradually, adjustment begins, not consciously, but automatically. Certain thoughts remain unspoken, certain feelings remain hidden, certain aspects of identity remain suppressed, not because they disappeared, but because expressing them feels unsafe. This is how identity becomes negotiated, not through force, but through fear. Fear of losing connection, fear of losing acceptance, fear of being abandoned. Schopenhauer recognized that much of human suffering originates in this process, not because relationships themselves are harmful, but because individuals abandon themselves in order to preserve them. They trade authenticity for security. They trade internal stability for external approval. And over time, they forget who they were before this negotiation began. This creates a quiet form of psychological exhaustion. Not dramatic, not visible, but constant, because maintaining an external identity requires continuous effort, continuous monitoring, continuous adjustment. The individual becomes divided between two selves, the self they are, and the self they believe they must be. And this division creates tension, because the authentic self cannot fully disappear. It remains present, beneath the performance, beneath the adjustment, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to be reclaimed. And this is where the possibility of transformation begins, not through external change, but through internal recognition. Once this pattern begins, it rarely stops on its own, because it becomes invisible. Not invisible in its effects, but invisible in its operation. People feel the anxiety, they feel the hesitation, they feel the constant pressure to adjust themselves, but they do not always understand where it comes from. They assume it is simply part of being human. They assume it is normal. But what they are experiencing is not their true nature. It is conditioning. Conditioning shaped through years of subtle reinforcement. Each time approval is given, the mind registers safety. Each time disapproval is experienced, the mind registers danger. Over time, the nervous system learns to associate acceptance with survival and rejection with threat, even when no real threat exists. This creates a powerful internal mechanism, one that operates automatically, without conscious awareness. Consider how often people replay conversations in their minds. Long after the conversation has ended, they think, "Did I say the wrong thing? Did they misunderstand me? Do they see me differently now?" This mental replay is not random. It is the mind attempting to protect social standing, because social standing has become psychologically linked to identity. Or consider how people behave differently depending on who they are with. With one group, they may appear confident, with another, reserved, with another, agreeable. Not because their core identity changes, but because their presentation adjusts to match expectations. This constant adjustment creates internal instability. Because there is no fixed center, the self becomes fluid, defined by context rather than clarity. This is why many people feel most at peace when they are alone. Because in solitude, there is no need to perform, no need to monitor, no need to adjust. The nervous system relaxes, the mind becomes quiet, because the threat of evaluation disappears. Schopenhauer recognized this clearly. He understood that dependence on external validation creates internal vulnerability, because anything external can be withdrawn. Approval can disappear without warning. Acceptance can turn into rejection. Respect can turn into dismissal. And when identity depends on these unstable forces, stability becomes impossible. This explains why even those who appear socially successful often feel deeply insecure. They may be admired, they may be respected, they may be accepted, but internally, they remain fragile, because their identity was built on approval, not authenticity. And approval is never guaranteed. It must constantly be maintained, constantly protected, constantly earned. This creates psychological exhaustion, a quiet, persistent tension beneath the surface. The individual becomes hyper-aware, hyper-vigilant, constantly scanning their environment for signs of approval or rejection, not consciously, but automatically. This hypervigilance prevents true relaxation, because the nervous system never fully disengages from evaluation. It remains alert, prepared, ready to adjust. This is why many people feel mentally exhausted even when they are physically safe. Their body is not under threat, but their identity feels vulnerable because it depends on forces outside their control. Schopenhauer understood that this dependence creates a subtle form of psychological imprisonment, not imposed by others, but maintained by the individual themselves, through fear, through conditioning, through unconscious habit. And the most powerful aspect of this prison is that it is rarely recognized. People do not realize they are inside it. They believe their fear is rational. They believe their hesitation is necessary. They believe their adjustment is natural. But what they are experiencing is not freedom. It is adaptation. Adaptation to expectations that may not reflect their true self. This creates a profound disconnection, a disconnection between internal truth and external expression. And this disconnection is the source of much human suffering. Because the authentic self remains present, but suppressed, silenced, ignored, not by force, but by fear. Fear of losing approval, fear of losing belonging, fear of losing connection. Yet paradoxically, this fear prevents the individual from experiencing genuine connection. Because connection built on performance is inherently fragile. It depends on maintaining the performance. It depends on maintaining the illusion. And maintaining an illusion requires constant effort. This is why so many people feel relief when they no longer need to perform. Why authenticity feels liberating. Why honesty feels powerful. Because authenticity removes the burden of maintenance. It removes the need for constant adjustment. It allows the individual to exist without division, without fragmentation, without fear of exposure. Schopenhauer understood that true psychological strength emerges only when identity is no longer dependent on external approval. Not because others stop having opinions, but because those opinions no longer define the self. This realization marks the beginning of freedom, not external freedom, but internal freedom. Freedom from unconscious dependence, freedom from constant self-monitoring, freedom from the invisible pressure to be someone else. And this freedom begins with recognition. Recognition of the patterns that have shaped identity. Recognition of the fears that have maintained them. Recognition of the self that exists beneath them. Waiting, not to be created, but to be remembered. Freedom does not begin with action. It begins with awareness, not dramatic awareness, not sudden realization, but quiet recognition. Recognition of patterns that were once invisible. Recognition of behaviors that once felt automatic. Recognition of how often fear, rather than truth, has shaped your decisions. At first, this awareness can feel uncomfortable because it reveals how much of your life has been shaped by unconscious adaptation. You begin to notice moments you once ignored, moments when you hesitate before speaking, moments when you suppress your natural response, moments when you adjust yourself without even thinking. And for the first time, you see the pattern clearly, not as isolated events, but as a system designed to preserve approval. Once you see it, something begins to change, not immediately in your actions, but in your relationship to your actions. You begin to pause. Before automatically adjusting yourself, you pause. Before automatically agreeing, you pause. Before automatically suppressing your thoughts, you pause. This pause is subtle, but it is powerful. Because within that pause, something new exists. Choice. For most of your life, your behavior has been shaped by conditioning. Conditioning designed to minimize rejection. But within this pause, conditioning loses its automatic power. You begin to observe your fear rather than obey it. You begin to observe your hesitation rather than become it. And this observation creates distance. Distance between who you are and the patterns that shaped you. This distance is the beginning of independence. Because once you can observe a pattern, you are no longer fully controlled by it. Imagine sitting in a conversation where you would normally agree, even though you internally disagree. In the past, the adjustment would happen automatically. But now, you notice the impulse, you notice the fear, you notice the hesitation. And instead of immediately suppressing yourself, you remain present. You do not force yourself to speak. You do not force yourself to resist. You simply remain aware. And sometimes, naturally, honesty emerges, not aggressively, not defensively, but calmly, clearly. And something important happens in that moment. Nothing catastrophic occurs. Rejection does not destroy you. Judgment does not erase you. Disapproval does not eliminate your existence. And slowly, your nervous system begins to learn something new. That authenticity is not as dangerous as conditioning suggested. This learning does not happen intellectually. It happens experientially, through lived experience, through moments where you remain aligned with yourself and survive, through moments where you exist honestly and remain safe. Each of these moments weakens the old conditioning. Each of these moments strengthens internal stability. Over time, the need to constantly adjust begins to fade, not because you force it to stop, but because it is no longer necessary. Your nervous system no longer interprets authenticity as threat. It begins to interpret authenticity as stability. This creates a new internal foundation. One that does not depend on approval. One that does not depend on acceptance. One that does not depend on external validation. From this foundation, confidence emerges naturally. Not performative confidence, not forced confidence, but quiet confidence. Confidence that does not need to prove itself. Confidence that does not need to defend itself. Confidence that exists independent of external reaction. This confidence changes how you experience social interaction. You no longer scan constantly for signs of approval. You no longer analyze every word after speaking. You no longer replay conversations in your mind searching for mistakes, because your identity is no longer at risk. It is no longer dependent on external response. It is rooted internally. This internal rooting creates psychological stability. Stability that remains even in uncertainty, even in rejection, even in disapproval, because rejection no longer threatens your existence. It simply becomes information. Information about compatibility, information about alignment, not information about your worth. This distinction changes everything, because once your worth is no longer externally defined, it becomes internally secure. Schopenhauer understood this transformation deeply. He knew that true independence begins when the individual no longer seeks themselves in the reactions of others, when identity is no longer constructed externally, but discovered internally. This discovery does not create a new self. It reveals the self that was always present, beneath the conditioning, beneath the adaptation, beneath the fear, waiting, not to be created, but to be reclaimed. And in reclaiming this self, something profound happens. The constant tension begins to dissolve. The internal division begins to close. The performance begins to fade. And what remains is simplicity, clarity, presence. You begin to exist without constant self-correction, without constant self-monitoring, without constant self-doubt, not because the world has changed, but because your relationship with yourself has changed. And this change marks the true beginning of freedom.
There comes a moment when the internal noise begins to quiet. Not because the world has become silent, but because you are no longer listening to it in the same way.
The constant need to evaluate yourself begins to dissolve.
The habit of monitoring every action begins to weaken.
And for the first time in a long time, you experience something unfamiliar. Stillness.
Not emptiness, but stability. You begin to move through the world without the constant burden of self-adjustment. Situations that once created anxiety begin to feel neutral. You no longer feel compelled to control how others perceive you. You no longer feel responsible for managing their opinions. Because you understand something clearly now. Their opinions were never yours to control. They were never yours to carry. They were never yours to obey. This realization creates a profound shift. One that is difficult to explain but unmistakable to experience. You begin to trust yourself again. Not because you believe you are perfect, but because you no longer believe you must be perfect to be accepted. You allow yourself to exist as you are, without constant correction, without constant justification, without constant fear of exposure. This creates a new kind of presence. A grounded presence, a calm presence, a presence that does not depend on external confirmation. Schopenhauer understood that this internal independence is the foundation of true freedom. Not freedom from circumstance, but freedom from psychological dependence. Freedom from unconscious submission to external judgment. Freedom from the invisible forces that once shaped your identity without your awareness. From this place, social interaction begins to change. Not because others behave differently, but because you do. You listen without needing to impress. You speak without needing to perform. You exist without needing to defend your existence. And paradoxically, this often creates deeper connection, because authenticity is inherently stable. It does not require maintenance. It does not require constant protection. It simply exists. This is why those who no longer seek approval often appear calm, not because they are indifferent, but because they are internally secure. Their identity is no longer fragile. It is no longer dependent on unstable external forces. It is rooted, grounded, stable. This stability creates a new relationship with uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer feels threatening, because your identity is no longer at stake. Rejection no longer feels like destruction, because your existence no longer depends on acceptance. Judgment no longer feels like exposure, because you are no longer hiding. This is what Schopenhauer meant when he spoke of independence of mind. Not isolation from others, but liberation from unconscious dependence. The ability to exist without constantly negotiating your identity. The ability to remain whole regardless of circumstance. And in this wholeness, something unexpected emerges.
Peace. Not temporary relief,
but lasting peace. Peace that does not depend on approval. Peace that does not depend on validation. Peace that exists because you are no longer divided against yourself.
This is the essence of the limitless mindset. Not the absence of challenge, not the absence of judgment, but the absence of psychological dependence. You are no longer controlled by forces you cannot control. You are no longer defined by opinions you did not choose. You are no longer shaped by fears that no longer serve you. You have returned to yourself, not by becoming someone new, but by releasing everything you were never meant to carry. And in that moment, something becomes clear. You were never truly trapped, only conditioned. And now, through awareness, through understanding, and through reclaiming your identity, you are free.